All right, you courageous Herle Burlyites. Today on the pod, I guess we've been trying to get on here for quite a while, and a topic I've wanted to explore for quite a while. Shimon Fogle, Chief Executive Officer of CIJA, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, is with me. Prior to his long career in Jewish advocacy, Mr. Fogle studied government and international relations at Clark University, going on to pursue graduate and doctoral studies at McGill. The Hill Times named him as one of the 100 most influential figures within Canada's political sector, and Embassy magazine ranked him among the 50 most important people influencing our foreign policy. I've known Shimon for over 25 years now. We've been friends. I've done some work for Shimon at the center, and I have, in full disclosure, been to Israel a number of times, twice on CIJA-sponsored trips. Today, we're going to be talking about Israel and its political climate, which is so interesting at the moment, as well as the rise of anti-Semitism, anti-Israel sentiment, and hate crimes, both here in Canada and around the world. Shimon, I'm really glad that we can finally get our schedules to work here. Welcome to the Herle Burly mishpucha.
Well said, and it's a delight. It's a delight to join you, David.
You didn't know I had Yiddush fluency, did you?
I knew you liked smoked meat, so I imagine you're mourning the loss of the Maine in Montreal. But
I know it's sad, eh? Closing down. I know. Yeah, it's one of my funniest stories about Israel that when I went there, I was so excited about having all the deli food to choose from.
I remember you telling me and lamenting that you couldn't find it anywhere.
I could not find it anywhere, only this weird Middle Eastern food. All right. So can you, just to start off, because I doubt people know, can you tell us what CIJA does?
CIJA serves as the advocacy and public affairs arm of the federated community. There are federations, Jewish federations across the country. They really function in many respects like a Jewish United Way. They're the hub of the community, providing support for many beneficiary agencies that deal with social services and whatnot. And they, many decades ago, recognized that there was a need to have a dedicated arm that undertook and represented the organized Jewish community in the public square, in relations with governments, federal, provincial, and municipal. And so in a fairly sophisticated way, they created and renewed different institutions over time. People will recognize still the name Canadian Jewish Congress, which for 100 years was really the anchor of the organized Jewish community in terms of public affairs, for a variety of reasons. And as you suggested, you had some role in that. They've evolved into a consolidated unit, which is CIJA, and we represent the community across the spectrum of public policy issues. So to be sure, Israel is a large part of that, as is anti-Semitism, but social services delivered provincially, federally, all public policy issues are on our agenda, and we represent the community's perspective and seek to contribute to the public conversation about all of those issues.
Okay. How did you get involved in it, Shimon? What's your path to this role? How did you get involved in advocacy?
So it goes back to babysitting. There's a fellow that by the name of Meyer Bick, a deeply well-regarded personality based in Montreal, who was one of my childhood babysitters. And Meyer served as the first director of the Canada-Israel Committee, one of the agencies that is now wrapped up into CIJA. And because there was a family relationship, I would come into contact with him as I was growing up, and Meyer's description of what he did, representing the Jewish community perspective on Canada-Israel relations, engaging with the political sector. It sounded like the most exciting thing in the world, and it's all I ever wanted to do. And in fact, that's all I ever did do professionally. So you can blame Meyer or you can thank him, but he's somebody who's been a mentor, a friend, and in his own right, a really important figure in the Jewish community over the years. So I got my start back in 87, I think, 88, with the Canada-Israel Committee, and I've stuck with it ever since.
Did you ever live in Israel?
No.
No?
No, I was born and raised in Montreal, and spent a little bit of time out in the Maritimes while I was waiting for things to align at the Canada-Israel Committee. It was known that I was going to join, but other people, there was movement of other people as well. So I spent a little time in Atlantic Canada, and then established home in Ottawa and have loved it ever since.
All right. So what is I've got a couple things I want to talk to you about, but let me just ask you, what's the main focus of your work these days?
So as you suggested in your intro, anti-Semitism is, it looms very, very large on the community agenda. There's a great degree of, there's a great French word, inquiète. There's a tension and an anxiety within the community as they see anti-Semitism reassert itself, both bringing back old experiences, but also introducing new sources of anti-Semitism that we hadn't experienced before. So that's a big preoccupation for the Jewish community. And I think coming out of COVID, we as a community, like so many others, are trying to reposition ourselves based on that experience, and to, in effect, rebuild a sense of dynamism and engagement that had been absent for almost 3 years.
Right. So if you're a non-Jew, you can go through your day pretty much without seeing many examples or any of anti-Semitic behavior on the part of people. So it's somewhat tempting to say that Jewish people are on heightened alert about hate crimes. But then I did some research. I looked at some studies. And what I found was that anti-Semitic activity is up significantly all over the world. And interestingly enough, the very large majority of religious-based hate crimes are anti-Semitic hate crimes, not anti-Islamic hate crimes, not other things, but anti-Semitic hate crimes. What do you, first of all, am I right? What are the statistics? And second of all, what do you attribute to the rise of this? What's going on?
So, unfortunately, I think, David, you are right. There has been a significant rise in anti-Semitism. Let me preface it by saying, because I think it's always important to place it in a context. Relatively speaking, I would argue Canada is probably the best place for somebody to live if they're part of a minority or racialized community. That's not to say we don't have our challenges here. They're serious, and they're well entrenched. But when you compare the experience, for example, in Europe, there's no comparison. The intensity of hate being expressed and acted on is much more acute than here in Canada. Still, we have to see the European experience, for example, as a bellwether, and we have seen the rise of lots of different signs that confirm the statistics that you quoted. So it's really worrisome, and it begs the question: where the hell does this come from? And I think that observations over not just decades, but centuries, even millennia, suggest whenever there is an unsettled atmosphere out there in society, hate and persecution, targeted discrimination tends to go up. And I think that we are, it's self-evident that we're living in a time when things are very, very unstable, uncertain, Things are changing very rapidly. There are generic things that are not specific to any particular community, like environmental concerns, challenges to the principles of democracy and the rule of law. All of these things contribute and are exacerbated by uncertainty on the economic side that generates a lot of anxiety within society writ large. And that serves as fertile ground for people to play out on even dormant tropes of discrimination and hate. If you add to that, David, some of the, and I'll choose my words carefully here, some of the awakening of recognition that there are elements of racism that are deeply entrenched in society. And that has been expressed most visibly in the United States, but it leaches elsewhere and others cotton onto it. But between that kind of recognition, that sense that we have to fix fundamental things within our society. And that means change. And change always is a driver of more anxiety and uncertainty. Part of what we see on the extreme right is a manifestation of that fear that people, especially white Christian-based communities, have about what their place in society is going to be. If they're portrayed in a particular way, and they are, then that means that there are challenges to the status quo. So when we bring it back to anti-Semitism and we talk about where has the rise been, where's the increase, what's been the trigger for that, in that sector, it's been this whole thing that's now reduced to the notion of replacement theory. The Jews will not replace us. Now, they're not talking about the Jews replacing whites. They're talking about Jews being facilitator of pushing whites out of their privileged places and replacing them with people of color, with immigrants, with all sorts of groups that had not traditionally been seen as holding.
Well, what does it have to do with the Jewish community, though, Shimon?
I'm sorry?
What does it have to do with the Jewish community?
Because for right-wing extremists, Jews are seen as the manipulators and the engine of those kind of changes. So, we're in a weird situation. There's lots of hate, David, going around, and directed at a lot of different groups. We are focused right now on hate that's directed to people of color, to racialized communities, and that has its own challenges. But what's common to all hate is an agreement that Jews are at the source. So for people on the right, Jews control the media, Jews control international finance, Jews control governments and hold the puppet strings for what happens in society. And as a result, Jews then become the target of hate because they're the instigators or the engine of the change that is challenging the place of whites.
You regular listeners know I'm a son of rural Canada, Prelate, Saskatchewan. Today's population, somewhere around 116. But like so many before us, and many more after, my parents moved the Herle clan to Regina for better education, better health care, and more opportunity. Today, because of digital connectivity, these opportunities can come to Prelate and all rural and Indigenous communities. Our presenting sponsor, Telus, has been proving it for years now, working to bring the digital tools and infrastructure these communities need to thrive, so families can access online education, work, healthcare, and other services, and stay in the places that are so much a part of who they are. But this is no gauzy, romantic story about how digital access can preserve small-town values, Herle Burlyites. It is a value story, an economic one. According to StatsCan, the mobile telco industry contributed $25.5 billion to our GDP in 2020. In 2019, it was 1.2% of total GDP. Capital expenditure in wired and wireless telecommunications was over $10 billion in 2020, or roughly $260 a Canadian. And get this, the industry is responsible for creating an estimated 145,700 jobs. Any way you cut those numbers, it's an immense contribution to our economy. The recent Auditor General's report on the status of rural connectivity has made it abundantly clear that connectivity is a driver of economic growth for all communities in Canada, urban, rural, and remote, and that we all need access to affordable, high-speed internet and mobile to participate in the digital economy. Telus, to borrow a phrase, is so down with that. They want to up the ante, work with governments to meet and even exceed their target of 100% connectivity by 2030. Never more important than now during this critical time of economic rebuilding. Go to telus.com/rural to learn more. So, in some of the polling that I've done for you over the years, we tested the salience of some of these anti-Semitic tropes, whether it's too much power in media or control the banks and too much money. And it's a very small minority of the Canadian population that believes this, but nonetheless a significant amount of people, right? Probably let's ballpark it at around 20%. So what does that mean in terms of hate activity? That you've got 80% of the people that don't believe any of this and are just going about their lives, but you've got 20% who do.
So I think that what we have to attach to the numbers are intensity of activism. If that 20% are more motivated, are more animated, more engaged, they're going to have a louder voice than the 80% who are soft-spoken or unengaged. Right. In Jewish tradition, we often use the analogy of a charity box, and everybody's seen them. You put coins in it at 7-Eleven or whatever. A coin box that has just a handful of loonies and toonies. When you shake it around, it's going to make a lot of noise. When it's full, it's not going to make any noise. So what we are hearing and what is defining the conversation publicly are those voices that are amplified in ways that speak to a particular kind of motivation. So it may be 20%, but if that 20% have exceptionally loud voices, they are going to have a disproportionate influence on the public perception, the public conversation. But I got to tell you, David, there's another paradox, which is that in polling that you've done for us over the years, or more recent studies that we've had access to, most Canadians don't believe that anti-Semitism is a problem.
Right.
Now, if they were confronted with an anti-Semitic incident, they would, by and large, respond to it in an appropriate way. They would be supportive, they would be sympathetic, they would object to that kind of behavior. But it's not obvious to anybody that anti-Semitism is a thing anymore. So part of the challenge for us is to be able to unpack what anti-Semitism today looks like, and why it's a source of anxiety for the Jewish community and requires us to push back against it. The real problem, David, though, is that anti-Semitism doesn't have just one source. It has multiple sources, and it's manifest in different ways. So we talked just a moment ago about anti-Semitism on the right, but there's also anti-Semitism on the left. And that comes from that.
I associate that with more anti-Israel than anti-Semitism. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, maybe.
Okay.
But again, it's very nuanced. So let me separate into two things. One is pure anti-Semitism. One is Israel-related anti-Semitism. On the purist side, within the context of critical race theory and woke sentiment, and so forth, much of which is important stuff for us to deal with. I don't want to be dismissive or sanguine about those sentiments that express real outrage, anger, and despair about just, some call it structural or systemic, but racism that has just not allowed people and groups to break through and play on a level playing field. So there's important stuff that has been going on that we should all take to heart and we should all embrace and engage.
Right.
But there is an added layer that some have advanced that see this in ideological terms and in a very binary way. So there's only the oppressed and the oppressor. And ironically, they don't even give agency to the oppressed. There's no sense that there's something that those who have been disadvantaged can do in order to improve their circumstances, their opportunities, and to claim a fuller share of life. In that dynamic is something that we call erasive anti-Semitism. So it denies the Jewish lived experience. It doesn't regard even things as catastrophic as the Holocaust, because that was white on white crime, as really constituting a kind of hate that society has to pay attention to. And then they can't help but fall into the tropes that are expressed on the right. Jews control the media. Jews are Hollywood. I mean, let's, look at the Dave Chappelle imbroglio from a few months. So they play into this notion that if Jews aren't part of white privileged, they're adjacent. And in that regard, don't merit the same kind of consideration as other groups who are facing any kind of hate or discrimination or racism. And then we get to the second thing that you asked about, which is the Israel part. Israel's really complicated. Some prefer to reduce it to simplistic terms, but you've been there, you've studied the issues, you know that it actually is very complicated. And getting to the promised land of two states for two peoples, recognition along the lines of what the Abraham Accords have realized with a number of Arab states. Getting there is not something that's going to be resolved overnight. So Israel is a target for criticism. Israeli government policy is certainly a legitimate target of criticism for those that object to particular policies or an approach or even sort of the philosophical identity of a particular government. But too often it leaches into questions about the legitimacy of the Jewish state, of the right of Israel to exist, of the right of the Jewish people to return to their ancestral homeland. And that becomes something very different. That's no longer legitimate criticism of an Israeli government or policies of a particular government. That is delegitimization of the right of Jews to self-determination. And from our perspective, and I think an objective one, that does constitute an expression of anti-Semitism, because what it does is it differentiates between what Jews are entitled to and what everybody else is. And if we accept that every other people, every other identifiable group has an entitlement to self-determination, you can't exclude the Jewish community from that. So how does that play out in terms of anti-Semitism? I mean, you can call it anti-Semitic and okay, so it's anti-Semitism. But in progressive circles, it has now become the case that support for Israel is a litmus test about your legitimacy of being included in that space. So if you express support for Israel, if you identify with Israel as the Jewish state, if you have and express those kind of connections and even advocate for a strong Israel or a strong Canada-Israel relationship, then you're disqualified from participating in those progressive spaces. Now, I don't have to tell you, you know enough people in the Jewish community to know that progressive, small p progressive ideas and values are like encoded into our DNA. There's for Bible loving viewers of the podcast, I would invite them to just quickly go back and refresh their knowledge of Leviticus chapter 19, which is seen as the quintessential statement about morality, ethics, equity, and values-based living. So for us, being in those spaces that want to improve and correct and remedy and mitigate discrimination and hate, whether it's directed against races, whether it's directed against segments of the LGBTQ plus community, whether it targets the poor, immigrants, you name it. Jews have been there. Today, they can't be part of that conversation unless they take off the mantle of support for connection to Israel. So it's in that respect that Israel has sort of converged with classical anti-Semitism in a way that makes it almost impossible for us to have a conversation without having to surrender a connection to Israel.
Right. But now, Israelis must be aware of how the country is perceived in those progressive circles around the world. They seem disinterested in that global opinion. Should they be? Am I right? And should they be?
They seem disinterested?
Well, I mean, in terms of putting this government in office, which would be probably the most antagonistic government to those progressive forces around the world.
So, David, I know you're saying this only to provoke the discussion, but take a look at what's happening in Israel today. The country is split down the middle. Yes, there is a government in place that clearly and in many respects unapologetically is asserting a particular view, set of values, approach to governance, to legislation, to a vision of what Israel should be. And they do benefit from support of pretty much half the country. The other 50% are not so
outraged.
They're on the streets every week. And, you have to be pretty fluent to be able to decode what's going on. Because first it was about judicial reform, but it's not really about judicial reform. Ironically, some of the proposed legislation actually copies what already exists in Canada. As Adam Dodick, the former dean of Ottawa U Law School, said in a seminar that we hosted, the notwithstanding clause is indeed a thing in Canada, but most would agree it's not a good thing. So why would Israel adopt a process that we, for circumstances, may have felt compelled to introduce back in the day, but don't really think makes for good governance, judicial independence, and so forth. But it quickly became evident, David, that it wasn't about judicial reform. It wasn't about any particular piece of legislation, even though there's serious objections to all of that. It's about what the government represents. And Israel, as it celebrates its 75th anniversary, is embroiled in an almost existential battle about the soul of the state, how the state is going to be defined. Is it a Jewish state? Is it a state of the Jewish people? What gets priority? So, circling back to where you started this, Israelis are not sanguine. Half of Israelis are deeply, deeply anxious about where the government is going, and they will not settle. And they've said it publicly, so it's not my editorial comment. They will not rest until they bring about the defeat of this government, which they think is unholy. There's so much packed into that, David. There's what should the character of the state be in terms of its relationship to Judaism and Jewishness defining the state. It was never a debate about freedom of religion, because freedom of religion isn't up for debate. There is full freedom in that regard. Israel's the only country where the Christian population is growing. 20% of the population is Muslim. Baha'i sees its home in Haifa. So it's not about religious freedom of practice. It's about the extent to which a Jewish character is going to inform what the state looks like. And I don't know where it goes from here. It doesn't touch progressive ideas in the same way as we're struggling with them here in Canada or in the United States. But it does talk about progressive ideas in terms of the rights of the individual versus the rights of the collective. And, I would say that those who are passionately opposed to the current government see the rights of the individual as the ultimate expression of freedom and democracy, and have to trump, forgive the pun, those of the collective.
So, I want to ask a question. And quite frankly, it's a question most of us should be asking right now. As I've explained here before, the federal government intends to impose a new rule on the country's railways. It's called extended interswitching, and basically it means shippers will be able to force railways to hand off cargo to one another, possibly multiple times, between origin and destination, at the expense of the railways. I've compared it to forcing airlines to deliver passengers to their competitors back and forth on several flights, instead of a direct nonstop. This will, without question, slow down cargo. Our sponsor, CN, reckons it may delay shipping times by up to 25%. And it will cost all the railways money, a lot of money. Such costs are inevitably passed on to consumers, and that's just the way the economy works. So, just to be clear, the government intends to impose rules that will needlessly clog our domestic supply chains and increase sticker shock for consumers at a time when Canadians are already struggling with sharp increases in the price of groceries, fuel, and most other items on the store shelves. My question is simple. Why? Why is the government determined to do this? It's been tried before and it didn't work. And who exactly benefits? Because someone will definitely benefit. The last time this pilot was tried, it was an American railway that benefited most. I suspect that didn't create any jobs in Canada. More on this in the weeks to come. Meanwhile, think about it. Everything you buy, and I mean everything, travels by rail at some stage. CN, for one, does not want to see supply chain efficiency deteriorate, investment in Canadian infrastructure deteriorate, and needless price increases. Do you? So maybe it wasn't about judicial reform, and I hear you that it's more existential than that, and there are deep things underlying it. But I was quite interested in the judicial reform element of it, because I remember when I did work with you, that the notion that Israel had a Supreme Court, like the Canadian Supreme Court, was an important part of the messaging you wanted people to understand, that this was a liberal democracy with a pluralistic set of values, where there was a gay pride parade and where you had Medicare and where there was a Supreme Court that protected minority rights in the country. So that was the understanding of Israel you wanted people to have. So how does this affect all that?
So I think in some respects it challenges it. It wasn't just that it had a Supreme Court; it had an independent Supreme Court,
right?
And some of the concern that's been expressed by really thoughtful people. We're not talking about enemies of Israel or enemies of the Jewish people. People like Erwin Kotler, who is not agnostic about the importance of the Jewish state. Rosie Abella, Beverly McLaughlin. There are some serious names that we would all recognize here in Canada who've expressed concern about where the proposed legislation on judicial reform is going. I don't want to get into the weeds about it. I will simply say that Israel's ability to reassure the international community, its friends like Canada, that it is protecting those very things, an independent judiciary, is vital if Israel's going to retain its place within the family of Western nations. It's the basis, and you've alluded to it a couple of times, but the work that we did together on shared values between Canada and Israel is very much based on principles like an independent judiciary, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and so forth. Now, initially, I was heartened, David, after the initial outcries. I was somewhat encouraged when the government pressed the pause button, because part of it was about the process, that it was, Israelis have been talking for decades about the need for judicial reform. And there are reasons that I'm not sure your audience would be interested in for why judicial reform is a good thing for Israel to undertake. And there are legitimate reasons to do that. You want an independent judiciary, but you don't want it to replace the legislative branch of government and so forth. But at a minimum, people were worked up about the process that was put into place. So rather than trying to achieve some kind of broad consensus about what should be reformed and how those reforms should take place, which is what you would expect on something as fundamental as the judiciary. That's the backbone of a democratic system. They were going through in a very aggressive, controlled way in order to ram through this stuff. So when the government pressed pause, when Netanyahu said, we are going to step back, we are going to participate in a process led by President Herzog, and under his, it's actually taking place effectively in the president's precinct. We're going to participate in a process that seeks to identify where compromise can be reached, where consensus can be achieved. And so I was much more optimistic that, the government did something. It did it clumsily. It did it maybe even stupidly and arrogantly. But they've now pulled back. They've listened to the objections, and we can move forward. But the messages that were coming out subsequent to that from the protest side made it clear that it wasn't just about judicial reform. It's about something much, much broader. So I agree with you that Israel has a real interest in reassuring the international community, friends like Canada and the European Union, that it continues to be committed to an independent judiciary. And I'll tell you one of the reasons why. There is a notion in international law that informs the ICC, the International Criminal Court, the IJC, and so forth. Or there's a broad concept of universal jurisdiction. And that is used to determine when does the international community have to step in and intervene in a juridical process because there's no confidence that a country can handle that themselves.
Right.
So that gave rise to a concept called complementarity. And so when a complaint is brought to something like the ICC or the ICJ, the first test that that institution will apply is whether the country in question has both the capacity and the political will to pursue a just and independent course. So, to translate that into something practical, if the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, is accused of war crimes, and a charge is filed, or a complaint is filed with the court, the international court, the first thing the court's going to do is say, okay, how does Israel propose to deal with that accusation? And it will look to the record. It will see that the court is indeed independent, that it can push back against the government, that it can judge against the army independently and with authority, and that its decisions will be carried out. So I'm being oversimplistic about the process, I admit, but that's the gist of it.
Yeah.
So imagine, David, if changes are brought about to Israel's judicial system, to how judges are selected, to the latitude and independence the court has, which can't be overridden by the parliamentary branch, the Knesset. If changes are made in ways that raise doubts about the ability of a court to exercise independence and pursue established and accepted standards and practices in terms of adjudicating those kind of cases, it changes everything. It changes the willingness of the International Criminal Court to hear a case. It would change the level of support that Canada has for Israel as an ally. And, Canada, successive governments up to today have gone to bat for Israel countless times, whether at the UN or its institutions or in other fora, including the Commonwealth, the G7, the G20, Francophonie, you name it. But that's predicated on having a high level of confidence that Canada and Israel are aligned in terms of the values that they share. And that's one of the big risks of what's playing out in Israel right now. I don't know where it's going to go. I have to tell you, frankly, David, that our community here in Canada, the Jewish community, is torn, reflecting in some respects what's playing out on the streets in Israel. The difference, of course, is that there's an internal debate about the extent to which we should be publicly engaged in this. We're not Israeli citizens. We don't bear the consequences of decisions taken in Israel in the way that Israelis do. Our children don't serve in the armed forces and so forth. So the question has been, the debate has been, how do we convey and communicate the concerns that we have about what's going on in an effective and constructive way? And that debate, frankly, is not resolved. There are groups within the Jewish community who are much more vocal and aggressive about expressing their unhappiness, disagreement, even condemnation of the Israeli government, notwithstanding that it was elected democratically and that it has a real constituency in Israel. So I don't know where that conversation ends.
It's not often that you find labor and industry coming together, but that's the case for our sponsor Uber and their collaboration with the United Food and Commercial Workers of Canada. Why would the leading rideshare and delivery platform in Canada and one of the country's largest private sector unions work together, you may ask? The answer may surprise you, folks. The fact of the matter is that in 2023, there are no legislative frameworks in place that offer benefits and protections to gig workers like drivers and delivery people. Tired of the status quo, Uber and UFCW Canada sought a way to create a better future for app-based workers across the country. The landmark agreement they signed on January 27, 2022 outlines their commitment to over 100,000 drivers and delivery people on Uber. 89% of them support this agreement. What does this look like in action? When Wasim from Toronto got locked out of his Uber driver account after trying to add his new car, he didn't have to tackle this issue on his own. Wasim was able to contact UFCW, explained his situation, and a casework team member helped him get back on the Uber platform. Before the agreement, Wasim's story and hundreds like it would not have been possible. With the agreement in place, over 750 drivers and delivery people had access to representation when they needed it most. Learn more about the impact of this historic agreement for hundreds of people like Wasim at uber.com/UFCW Canada. Without getting too deep into the weeds of domestic Israeli policy, how much of what is going on is shifting demographics not between Jews and other ethnic groups in Israel, but between different kinds of Jews? Are things like the Supreme Court products of the Ashkenazi tradition of Israel, and as the Jews that came to Israel from Africa and other places less committed to those liberal ideals, perhaps?
That's a great question. It's actually a great insight because it touches on one of the real core things that's playing out in Israel right now, and that is, forgive me using these terms, but people here will relate better to them. It's challenges that are now being articulated and expressed against Israel's WASP elite, Jews of color and Middle Eastern Jews, the ones that fled all of those Arab states back in 48. Back then it was 750,000 of them. They've grown. The first sea change was when Menachem Begin came to power in 1977. And that really was a challenge to the European-centric if not socialist, then we'll call it progressive. They didn't use those terms.
The kibbutzes.
Yeah. The kibbutzim, but that kind of intellectual elite.
Yeah.
What we actually saw in the Democratic Party in the U.S., up to and including the Clinton years, ironically, people would automatically or instinctively associate the Democratic Party with blue collar, low middle income families, just people grinding it out and trying to make a living in a family, new immigrants coming in and so forth. But they were really ruled by an intellectual elite. And the same played out in Israel. part of what this battle about now isn't a disregard for democratic values. It's more about asserting their dominance, having been perceived as second-class citizens for so long. And they constitute the majority in Israel now. The white European-based elites, the Tel Aviv bubble, as some call it, is shrinking in size relative to those that have come.
That's why the Labour Party is so insignificant now, correct?
It virtually doesn't exist.
Right. It used to govern the country regularly.
Right. Now, I think this is my prediction, because as time goes on and different segments of a society experience more and more success. So, we can look at, for example, the Ethiopian experience. When they came to Israel, pretty backwards in terms of being confronted with modern society that they just had no terms of reference for. The success of their integration has been remarkable, but it's also given rise to a desire to assert a particular identity. And it's not the same as my background. They have their own collective lived experience. They have their own identity and cultural touchstones. And they want to be recognized for what they are, not somehow, ground into a melting pot. Or
grateful just to be there.
Yeah, and that is part of what's playing out. But as they become more secure and confident in their own identity, I think that they will just inherently gravitate to some of those progressive ideas that some are suggesting are they're opposed to.
Well, gee, Shimon, I don't know. The inevitable victory of liberal democracy seems less inevitable than it did a couple of decades ago.
David, I'm not sure that's a bad thing. And I'll tell you why. Because when we take it for granted, we become very complacent. If we have to fight and remind people and do a reality check, and even maybe some introspection about whether we're doing everything right, if we have to do that periodically, it actually leads to a strengthening of that of that worldview, of that notion of collective responsibility, of the idea that we actually are our brother's keepers, that we have a social conscience and responsibilities to others. So I don't think it's a bad idea that it's tested. I have confidence that it will always come out on top.
Awesome. Hey, let's talk about another reality of Israel and its reputation internationally. So in preparation for this interview, I went on my Apple News service. I don't know if you subscribe to this or not, but I do. I went on my Apple News service, and it has access to all newspapers and magazines all over the world. And I typed in Israel. And despite the incredibly interesting political developments that we've been discussing in Israel, the first 40 or more articles that came up, literally, I had to keep scrolling and scrolling, were about attacks by the Israeli military in Gaza. Like, that was the news globally from Israel, as near as I could tell.
Yeah.
Right? Why does that conflict get so much international attention?
So the short answer, David, is I don't know. There is a preoccupation with Jews. That has certainly been my consistent observation over time. When I think of the number of conflicts, hot conflicts, that exist globally at any given time, the Arab, Israel-Palestinian conflict is not significant. There was a time when more kids were dying in the Congo every week than had died, Jews, Arabs, Palestinians alike, since 1948. what's happening to the Rohingya, the Uyghurs, gets episodic, passing attention. There is a preoccupation with this that speaks to something else. Now, I don't want that to be understood as me being dismissive of the real challenges in terms of the conflict, of getting past that to a better place. But there's always a context to flare-ups, and inevitably, it's not a vicious cycle. There is a beginning, and then there's a consequence. So, for Israelis, what's happening in Gaza over the last 48 hours is significant and important, because there's always the potential for this to spill out into something much larger, much more difficult, and much more deadly. So Israeli governments have some real pressure to act with restraint, and there are constraints on them. But the international community's preoccupation with Israel is something that I don't know can be explained in any other way.
Okay, so let me put this to you as provocatively as I can put it to you. Okay. Let's say that if I was to say to you that Israel seems to have made peace with all of its Arab neighbors, with the exception of Iran, and the Abraham Accords and things to follow, it doesn't seem like that region is particularly at risk of war anymore. And what we're left with is a sophisticated 21st century military firing American-made missiles at people who are armed with rocks. So, I mean, why? It's the imbalance in the combatants, I think, that drags people's attention.
So that is pretty provocative. I guess the conversation's been too tame till now.
Well, I'm just trying to put to you how some people say it,
And I hear that. I recognize it. It's one of the challenges of what we call asymmetrical warfare, that the two sides aren't playing by the same rules. So let me flip that for a second. Most of Israel's capacity actually goes into defensive measures. If you had to track what has benefited in terms of allocations of resources most, it would be systems like Iron Dome, which are entirely defensive, right? Their only purpose is to intercept missiles coming in.
Right.
Now, Israel is, to be sure, not perfect. Sometimes it makes mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes are irresponsible mistakes. So I'm not whitewashing responsibility that falls to Israel. But for the most part, Israel's offensive actions are very, very targeted. Yes, there's sometimes collateral damage, and sometimes it goes catastrophically wrong. But for the most part, they're very, very targeted, very precise, even surgical. And Israel has developed lots of different ways. The famous knocking on the roof, which is a way that Israel has to signal to civilians to leave a particular area because there's a munitions depot that Israel is going to be targeting. So they give them time to go out. The flip side, though, David, is this. Unlike Israel's targeted or surgical strikes, the missiles lobbed from Gaza or from Lebanon into the north of Israel are aimed at civilian population centers. The fact that they don't get through most of the time is as a result of Israel spending a obscene amount of money on defensive measures. But if one did get through, just one, you would have losses that you wouldn't even want to contemplate. So yes, it's asymmetrical, but so are the values that inform the behavior of the different sides. And for Hamas, for example, in Gaza, there is a desire often to provoke a kind of Israeli reaction that plays into the narrative that you just described. So events are fabricated, narratives are cobbled together in order to support a particular storyline, and then Israel plays into that because it feels an obligation to protect its citizens. Not pretty, but what we can't leave aside from that, because you were right to note that Israel has succeeded in achieving peace with multiple nations that were formerly hostile, and there are more that appear to be lining up. How has it failed to achieve peace with Palestinians? And, for people like me, one of the most agonizing and frustrating dimensions of this question is how many times Israel has genuinely gone forward with a package or a proposal backed by the international community that would achieve for the Palestinians pretty much everything that they aspire to secure, and it's been rejected.
With the exception of right of return, which we are not offering in Prelate, Saskatchewan either.
Right. So the right of return is something I think that there's a broad consensus is just code word for the destruction of Israel, and it's not an option.
I understand that.
Compensation for those who lived in Israel is. And was part of the different packages put forward. So, I think, getting back to where we started about agency, we tend here in the West to infantilize Palestinians, and we deny them agency, responsibility for defining their own future, for taking ownership of their destiny, for seeing themselves as real vested stakeholders in an option towards peace. I think, I would have said this with absolute certainty until relatively recently. Now it's confidence mixed with a little hope. But I think the moment that Palestinian leadership emerges that's genuinely committed to pursuing peace, they will find in Israel a partner that is unconditional in moving towards satisfying Palestinian aspirations.
The settlements don't seem consistent with that.
They don't. So here's what I have to say about settlements. There actually have been, notwithstanding all of the noise that's been created, virtually no new settlement developments in decades. The ones that are
I
there.
thought Netanyahu was really expanding this or allowing it to expand.
Well, so there's lots of rhetoric. I will distinguish between new settlements and natural growth of existing settlements. But here's the real test, David, and we've seen it proved twice. In peace with Egypt, Israel had settlements in the Sinai. It dragged people out of their homes. It bulldozed apartments and homes in order to satisfy the conditions of securing peace with Egypt. In a unilateral, preemptive way, Israel under Sharon did the same thing in Gaza. And, those wounds haven't entirely healed, but in the hope that Israel removing all settlements from Gaza
Right.
Would signal to Palestinians the genuine interest of Israel to move in a direction of reconciliation, peace, and partnership. And I know that that will be the case with respect to the presence of Israelis in the West Bank. Accommodations will be reached. There'll be land swaps. There are all sorts of formulas that have been put forward, but that will ultimately not be the impediment to peace. You know, I know we're getting to the end of your time, but there was a great expression. I don't know if it was Michael Oren, the former ambassador to Washington, the Israeli ambassador who said it, but Israelis can resist everything. All sorts of assaults, all attacks. Israelis can resist everything but an embrace.
That is a great line. That is a great line. And I'm going to follow it up by hitting you hard for the last time in this interview. But I want to actually give you a chance to address this. So why I'm putting it to you this way. You know that all across Canada on university campuses, people would say that the Palestinians don't have agency because Israel's running an apartheid state. And what is your response to that?
I would just reject it. Apartheid has a particular meaning, notwithstanding some people from South Africa who have bitter experience with apartheid for politically motivated reasons, endorsing that proposition. I think that the tests of apartheid simply cannot be satisfied when looking at the Israeli experience. There is one caveat that I'll get to, but in Israel, you have no distinction between race, ethnic background, religion. You have Muslims and Arabs on the Supreme Court. You have doctors and nurses working together in the same emergency rooms at the hospitals. You have equal access to university education. There is nothing that is precluded that should give any credence to the charge of apartheid. There's a lot of discrimination that minority groups experience. That happens in every country. And to Israel's credit, even this government's credit, there are intentional, deliberate efforts to address those kind of things, inequity in education at the public school level and so forth. Where there's a concern, where there's the potential, David, for me not being able to respond with such an emphatic no, is if things changed in the West Bank. If Israel decided that it was going to take all of the West Bank, which is legally and technically considered occupied territory. By the way, it's not illegally occupied. Israel's actually the legal occupier because it's territory acquired through war. What Israel can't do is then claim that territory as part of its sovereign geography. If it does that, then you could make the argument about potential illegality. But even that's not entirely clear. But if Israel were to include the West Bank with all of the Palestinians there,
right,
and not grant those Palestinians citizenship, then you can make a case that Israel is practicing differential treatment. Yeah. But they're not citizens of Israel. They don't hold Israeli citizenship. Jerusalem is a bit different, and of course, like everything, more complicated. But the term apartheid was co-opted by anti-Israel forces because there isn't a dirtier word to use in Western society. There's nothing more evil
Right.
than the accusation of apartheid. So they tried to stick that on Israel. And for those that don't apply critical thinking, it resonates.
All right, I'd like to end with just a couple of open-ended questions for you that allow you to expand on things a little bit. One of which is, I'm 60 years old. When I was a kid, the Holocaust was a very, very fresh memory. It's one of the first things I remember learning about or being aware of. It was such a huge event in world history. And I didn't, as a kid, have any trouble understanding why Israel would exist as a safe homeland for Jewish people after what had happened to them. I did, as a child, have some questions about how the people that had previously lived there might feel about that, but I didn't have any questions about Israel's right to exist. 40 years from now, when the Holocaust is deep in the recesses of the collective consciousness of our society, superseded by much more recent events, on what basis would you hope that an average Canadian would be supportive of Israel?
I would hope that Canadians are supportive of Israel because they see it as the state of the Jewish people. They see it as the fulfillment of a 2 millennia process of being repatriated to their ancestral homeland, from which they were forcibly exiled. Notwithstanding those that try to deny the Jewish connection to the land, there is such overwhelming evidence that a Jewish commonwealth existed, was exiled, and it took 2,000 years to reclaim and reestablish a Jewish presence in the area. So I would hope that people recognize that as the fulfillment of the Jewish people's self-determination and return as an indigenous people to that piece of real estate. And I would hope that they support it because Israel speaks to the shared values that they have, that they want to protect and that they want to not just support, but spread everywhere else. Israel can serve as a light to the nations in the region, especially as some of those walls and barriers come down. That's a good thing. And that's something that I think all Canadians can sign on to.
Okay. And to loop back to the beginning of our conversation, what can an average citizen do about the rise of hate, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, all of its forms? Like, what are we supposed to be doing in our daily lives to combat this?
So that's so we should do a second podcast just about that.
Right.
Okay, my answer is predicated on a belief that I will explain in just a few words. Most hate, or most of what comes out as discrimination and hate, is ignorance. There's a small segment on the margins who are driven by intentional hate. Most others fall into it out of ignorance. So if that's the case, then my answer to your question is drop the barriers of ignorance. And that only comes through one thing: get to know the other. Most Canadians, I would argue, probably never came across a Jew, probably never had a conversation with a Muslim, have no idea the struggles that somebody from the LGBTQ plus community have gone through. So reach out and get to know them, because as soon as you do, not only will you almost certainly have a sympathetic heart, you're going to find so much commonality. You know, in my dream book, David, of
which you should write.
Resources, of resources to combat this kind of thing. If I had my way, I would collect $1 gazillion from funders, and I would host block parties across the country. You know, opportunities and platforms for people, no agenda, no speeches, just a picnic on the street, because most people have no idea who their neighbors are.
Right.
And if they did, they'd be happy and they'd want to go and have a beer with them. If we can create circumstances that do that, if governments like the current government here in Canada, I'm nonpartisan, but they are determined. This government is determined to address the issue of online hate and harms. That will address a lot of it. But even online, most of the time when kids are retweeting or reposting something hateful or offensive, they are doing it without any real appreciation that this is hurtful, that this is bullying. They just think it's fun. If we can undo that ignorance and replace it with some awareness and sensitivity, we will transform society.
Great. Well, Shimon, you are a really wise and thoughtful guy, and somebody that I've leaned on for advice over the years many, many times. So I really appreciate you coming on this show and sharing it with my audience.
David, it was an honor, and COVID has kept us apart. But now you've whet my appetite to buy you that smoked meat sandwich. So be forewarned.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks for your time today. Appreciate it. And I want to thank our presenting sponsor, Telus, our sponsors, CN and Uber Canada, everybody who watched or listened today, and of course, Shimon Fogle for being our guest today. Tune in next week for more of the Herle Burly. We'll see you then.
Herle Burly. Herle Burly. Herle Burly.
I hope it was okay.
Herle Burly. Herle Burly.
Yeah, you were gracious.